Impressive. Okay, welcome to Real Turkey channel. We are about to commence our official live broadcast in 2.5 minutes. Just doing microphone checks and trying to improve visual quality, which is going to remain poor because Turkey's internet lines are simply not made to cope with this much traffic, which seems to be the case everywhere in the world. Thanks for joining this podcast, and we're going to talk about the troubled relationship between Turkey and IMF, which is actually very interesting because IMF had one of its biggest successes in Turkey at the beginning of 21st century. Turkey by program. Why is Mr. Erdogan so vehemently opposed to IMF, and does Turkey need an IMF program? Are the questions I am going to answer in this brief broadcast, which is going to last about 6 or 7 hours, since I have nothing else to do. Being 60 years old, I have barricaded myself in my humble domicile until 2025. Okay, 30 more seconds. Just dribbling the ball in mid-court here until it is officially 3 p.m. in Turkey. I hate to be late or early. Okay, well, I can't stand it. I must broadcast. Dear YouTubers, welcome to Real Turkey channel, an English language broadcast live from Istanbul, presented by Atilla Yeşilara, which covers Turkish politics, economy, finance, and business news. Today, we're going to produce a cocktail of politics and economy. What is Turkey's problem with IMF? First, I'm going to explain why Turkey needs foreign funding, of which the only feasible supplier is IMF. And second, why is it Mr. President Erdogan's personal enmity against IMF that is stopping such a deal? And thirdly, what would happen to Turkish economy and balance of payments if Mr. Erdogan were not to relent? Does Turkey need foreign funding? Yes, it does. Central bank reserves are dwindling very rapidly. Over the last data week, central bank's gross reserves declined by another $2 billion to roughly $60 billion. Many articles published in the international financial press, such as those by Financial Times, Bloomberg, and Reuters, relying on experts, suggest that this number is inflated. In fact, central bank may not have any net foreign reserves left, and the number reported on its balance sheet might be $20 billion more than its official reserves. Nevertheless, it's still intervening in the currency market, trying to drive the dollar down. Of course, central bank reserves were always low in comparison to Turkey's foreign debt payments, and Turkish banks, which are the main borrowers abroad. Private sector borrows somewhat, I think at 33%, but usually private sector borrows FX through Turkish commercial banks. And over the last 12 months, Turkish banks rolled over or renewed only 70% of their maturing loans and bonds. So there is also an outflow of foreign currencies through this redemption channel. Turkey's foreign trade deficit is not large, but since we're not going to have any tourism revenue this year, it's going to mitigate the advantage that Turkey derives from falling oil prices. And more importantly, imports are stickier than exports. In other words, we import absolute necessities, whereas our exports demand on the progress of what happens in the EU and the Middle East, both of which are shut down. So for the next 3-4 months, we're going to be producing current account deficits, probably not big, $4 or $5 billion, which will also lead to an outflow from the system. As well, foreign financial investors, those who invest into stock and bond markets or who invest through the swap market, have also completely abandoned Turkey. Yesterday, we had previous week's data. Foreign investors have sold slightly over $500 million of bonds and stocks. And since the beginning of the year, they sold close to $8 billion of Turkish securities, financial assets. I don't have an exact calculation, but I am told by those who know that through the swap market, another $4 billion may have exited Turkey. That's the third channel through which money or hard currency flows out of Turkey. And fourthly, Turkish retailers are dollarizing. That is, they prefer to keep their savings in hard currencies rather than our domestic currency, Turkish lira. Now, as long as they keep their deposits in the banking system, that doesn't cause a major problem for the central bank, because banks turn over these deposits to central bank, and central bank uses it in currency intervention, which retailers buy again. It's sort of like, a virtuous cycle. However, our calculations, by ours, I mean, my economist friends, I can't even balance my checkbook, suggest that there is some leakage from the banking system. There is some people are withdrawing their hard currency deposits, preferring it, as the Turkish phrase goes, to keep it under their mattresses or in their vaults, or perhaps in gold. The sum might be about $10 billion. If you combine all of these, you would see that until the Turkish economy normalizes or until the appetite for emerging assets comes back, Turkey will suffer a substantial amount of outflows, and it will have a dearth of foreign currency. Of course, this has already reflected to the Turkish lira, which has lost roughly 4% against the dollar over the last month and has become one of the worst performing foreign currencies, EM currencies, vis-a-vis the American dollar. The depreciation of the lira is a big problem for the economy, which is not the case, for instance, for those who live in the Eurozone or in the United States. The value of the dollar may change 10-20%, and an American or a German or a Belgian would not feel it. In Turkey, it's different. Depreciation of the currency immediately passes through to domestic prices. Also, of course, if a company had borrowed in, say, dollars, but has revenues in Turkish lira, it has difficulty making interest and principal payments in dollars. That situation is exacerbated by the fact that now even the biggest companies don't have much of a cash flow, because while people can't consume, they are stuck in their homes. Combining all of this evidence, not only I, but Turkey's biggest industrialist lobby, TÜSİAD, as well as some regional business associations and a lot of economists, call on Mr. Erdogan to, sign a standby deal with IMF, which would bring in much needed hard currency, stabilize Turkish lira, as well as improve the sentiment of both financial investors and the business community by securing a certain exchange rate, a foreseeable exchange rate. In addition to standby, IMF had other facilities to help countries like Turkey. By the way, parenthetically, last time I counted, 92 countries have already applied to tap one form of financial aid that IMF offers. My apologies. However, Mr. Erdogan has openly and publicly denounced any IMF deal. And it is my understanding that even though these are readily available, we will not have a swap agreement with IMF. Through a swap agreement, we give them TL, IMF gives us a certain amount of dollars, which is roughly $10 billion. Not sufficient for the long term, but at the short term, it will also have a positive expectations effect. So the question, of course, is assuming you accept my thesis that Turkey does need an IMF standby program, why are we so dead set against an IMF program? The question becomes even more intriguing because when Mr. Erdogan came to power, he inherited an IMF program from the previous government, ushered by Mr. Kemal Dervish, who used to work for World Bank and now is, I think, a fellow at Brookings Institute. And this IMF program is one of the most successful in the fund's history, as well as the only successful one in Turkey's history, which I believe had so far 30 IMF programs. I may be wrong in the number, but it's definitely more than a score, that's for sure. It lasted until 2008, I believe, during which Turkey recorded real GDP growth rates over 6%, produced non-interest budget surpluses close to 5% of GDP. And despite that, Turkish inflation came down to single digits, not at 2008, but subsequently. Turkish lira appreciated. At some point in 2008, analysts like me were discussing whether Turkish lira would reach parity with the dollar. In other words, whether the exchange rate would be $1 to 1 TL. Now it is 6.87 the last time I checked. In other words, Mr. Erdogan has nothing to fear about the failure of an IMF program, as it happened in Argentina. He doesn't face elections, and there is a track record of success in such programs. The argument is made that the Turkish people are so against IMF that signing a standby program would be political suicide. Well, that's not exactly true. Certainly, certain segments of the population are against the IMF program. Some of them are Islamists because it's Western capital. Some of them are socialists and the labor class, which still think IMF would ask the government to reduce wages and salaries or cut other benefits, social benefits, pension benefits, etc. That was the old IMF. They really used to do this stuff. More correctly, they used to ask the government to come up with a certain amount of budget savings, and they didn't really care where those budget savings came from, which is a very cruel and heartless attitude, if you ask my viewpoint. But nowadays, IMF, thanks to Gita Genopath, has become much more sympathetic to the plight of the poor and downtrodden. And even though it's never sufficient, they do take precautions to assure that the low-income classes don't suffer much from these kind of programs. There is really not that much political opposition to an IMF standby deal. That, to the extent there is a political opposition, it's created by years of Mr. Erdogan's propaganda as portraying IMF as a tool of global imperialism and a tool of American interests. Mr. Erdogan made IMF an agency or a governor of a potential American mandate in Turkey. Is there any truth to it? There may be. I mean, certainly IMF does ask for conditions and certain rules to be followed. There is not much politics behind it, though I'm sure reasonable people would disagree with me. It depends on where you stand on the political spectrum. If you are close to socialism, you would probably agree with Mr. Erdogan. If you're like me, which is, a mainstream economist, more of a social democrat, you would see less harm in IMF borrowing. Uh, there is only one poll as to whether people want an IMF deal or not, and it has asked the question of, if Turkey had to borrow, which source would you prefer? And the choices were Russia, Arab countries, IMF, and the United States. Turks said Arab countries first and IMF second. They didn't want to borrow from Russia at all, which attests to the common sense of Turkish people. So really, I mean, the problem with Turks is we don't want to borrow from others because we would become dependent on them. But if we have to borrow, well, hell, why not IMF? So what might be the concealed reason behind Mr. Erdogan's resistance to an IMF deal? Well, simple. A potential IMF program would restrict his ability to run Turkey as he wishes, as his father's farm, as Turkey's expression goes. Currently, really, there is no rule of law in Turkey, and I'm very clear and frank about that. There is no constitution. The parliament works only when Mr. Erdogan wants it. The courts don't work at all. Essentially, Mr. Erdogan makes all the decisions. He decides who get the government tenders, how state banks lend to people, to which people, why they lend, and whether these loans are repaid or not. Now, obviously, it is an optimal situation for Mr. Erdogan to maximize his political benefits and to feed a large group of constituencies and cronies. It's not optimal for Turkish economy or for Turkish people. And Mr. Erdogan knows that if IMF comes, the condition for money would be transparency. There will have to be transparent budget accounting. There will have to be a decent balance sheet announcement and independent audit of state banks. The tender law will have to be changed so that there are competitive and transparent tenders. In other words, IMF will ask, how are you spending the money? Where are you spending the money? Why are you spending the money? To Mr. Erdogan's imperial and imperious personality, these are clearly unacceptable because he thinks he does the best for the Turkish people, and he doesn't want to be second guessed by IMF or by the Constitutional Court or by the opposition or by the parliament. This is why he will resist an IMF standby, even though it might be to the benefit of the Turkish people. Will he resist it even Turkey faces a balance of payments crisis, which is a situation where central bank runs out of reserves or it doesn't have sufficient reserves to cover Turkey's liabilities, and the currency goes into a downward spiral from which there is no coming back. We had something similar in the summer of 2008. To me, that scenario is a possibility. We might have a few weeks before it plays out. I mean, if we can control the COVID-19 outbreak in the next 2-3 weeks, if appetite for emerging market assets return, or if there are any other kind of reform movements in Turkey, obviously we can avert such a disastrous scenario. But otherwise, with each passing day, as central bank reserves dwindle, foreign creditors and investors would be more hesitant to lend or invest in Turkey, and Turks would get the hell out of the banking system. The question then becomes, will Mr. Erdogan relent? Obviously, opinions differ, and having watched this video, you may think I am an opponent of Erdogan, which I am, but I think he's still a rational man. And if he realizes we are 1 foot rationally when his back is to the corner in the past, like when Turkish Air Force downed a Russian jet, or when United States wanted Pastor Brunson back and Turkey initially refused, and then we had the currency crisis and Mr. Erdogan sent him back. I think we're going to have a replay of the history, but not before a currency crisis threatens. And finally, is there an alternative? I mean, can you do without IMF money and it's a balance of payments crisis? Yes, of course, in Turkey, and you would limit currency outflows from Turkey by, say, retailers. Not obviously not for trade purposes, but for financial purposes. So foreign investors would remain stuck in Turkey, and Turks won't be able to sell outside the country for investment purposes. That's a possibility, but it's very damaging. The general rule is if a country has both a current account deficit and a budget deficit, currency controls are more harmful than useful for the country. So, this was a very cheerful presentation by the Real Turkey channel, by your host, Atilla Yeşilada. With even better news, I hope to greet you next week. Stay home, stay with us. In a few months, we'll lick this nasty virus and go back to frolicking merrily in our backyards or in someone else's backyards. Thanks for watching. This was Atilla Yeşilada. Goodbye and have a good weekend.